In this video, we're going to look at several algebraic properties that we use when we solve linear equations. Over the first 2 pages of this, we're going to look at the most commonly used properties that we use when we're solving linear equations. You should be able to identify when these are being used in a particular problem and be able to identify them by name. We're going to look at the six most used properties that you'll see in linear equation solving. The first 4 on this front page are all of our properties of equality: the addition property of equality, the subtraction property of equality, multiplication property of equality, and division property of equality. And what every single one of these properties says is if we have two things that are equal, here A equals B, then what we can do is we can take those two things that are equal and we can add the same thing to both of them, and that thing remains equal. So what that means is when we have an equation, as long as we add the same thing to both sides, we've maintained an equality relationship. Same thing going down through the other 3 properties on this page for subtraction. If we subtract the same thing from both sides of an equation, then we end up with still something that's equal. Multiplication property: if we multiply both sides by the same thing, we continue to have something that's equal. And the division property: if we divide both sides by the same thing, then we continue to have something that's equal. So anytime that we add, subtract, multiply, or divide something through both sides of the equation, what we're doing is we're using one of these properties of equality to justify that step is correct. Okay? 2 other properties that we're going to be using frequently: the distributive property, which we use anytime there's a set of parentheses. A times the quantity B plus C, get rid of the parentheses and multiply A by both of the things that are in the parentheses. Similarly, I didn't feel the need to write this, but if we have A times the quantity B minus C, that's the same thing as A times B minus A times C. And then one other property that we'll see used frequently in equation solving, the commutative property of addition. All that says is if we're adding 2 things, we can switch the order in which we add them. And we do that sometimes in equation solving in order to group 2 like things together in the equation before we combine them. And those are our 6 properties: the addition property of equality, the subtraction property of equality, multiplication property of equality, division property of equality, the distributive property, and the commutative property of addition. That takes care of almost every step we'll ever make in solving a linear equation. All right, let's look at how we're going to identify these, and we're going to look at some solved equations and the properties that we use in solving them. So in this first example, we're solving the equation x divided by 5 minus 3 equals -1. And we want to figure out what property we used in order to go from the original equation to step 1. And if you take a look and think about, what happened to get from the original equation to step 1? Well, we added 3 to both sides of the equation. And so we added something to both sides of the equation, and that means that the property that we used was the addition property of equality. Okay. And now, in my next step, going from step 1 to step 2, what did I do to both sides of the equation to go from step 1 to step 2? I multiplied both sides by 5. And so I multiplied both sides by the same number and maintained the equality. So that is the multiplication property of equality. And that's a skill that you're going to need to have, is being able to identify what properties are used in these various steps. Let's do one more example. Okay, we start with the equation 4 times the quantity x plus 2 plus 5x equals 26. So the first thing we did here as we go from the original problem to step 1, if you take a look and you study what happened here, we got rid of the parentheses by multiplying the 4 through the parentheses. What property is that? That's the distributive property. Okay. In the second step here, step 2, what did we do? Well, we had two things that were being added, the 8 and the 5x, and we switched their order. So the property we used there was the commutative property. And then in the next step, we add the 4x and the 5x together. And you might think that that's not any of the properties that we use, but it really is one of the properties that we have. But a lot of times when you see someone solving an equation like this, they'll justify this step by saying that, it's simplification or combining like terms. And if you say combining like terms here, I would say that that's a reasonable explanation and justification of this step. What that really is, though, is it is the distributive property only going in the other direction. But I'm not going to delve too much into that. If you call this combining like terms, I'll be pretty happy. All right, and then going from step 3 to step 4, what did we do to get from step 3 to step 4? We subtracted 8 from both sides, and so that's going to be the subtraction property of equality. And to go from step 4 to step 5, we divided both sides by 9, and so that's going to be the division property of equality. Okay, so it's important that we know all 6 of these properties by name, and that we can identify which one of them is being used in any step in solving the equation process. All right, that concludes this video. See you next time.